today the president issued an executive order to replace the executive order that was the subject of so much litigation that constituted the travel ban, also delaying the processing of refugees. And so today was an important day when he issued this new executive order that was designed to replace that and hopefully, I think in his mind, eliminate all of the legal challenges to that particular executive order. So I've spent most of the day reading that executive order, trying to understand it. There, in addition to the executive order, was a press release, frequently asked questions, a fact sheet, an internal memorandum, and then a press conference, all of which was meant to explain this executive order, which, by the way, was a lot more helpful in terms of its communication, given all of these different modes of communication today, than the first one, which had very little background, very little around it, and made the executive order, frankly, very hard to understand, including the fact that agencies weren't consulted before it was issued. But today was different. It was very clear that all of the agencies were consulted. It was very clear that the agencies were in the know. They had already prepared these frequently asked questions documents and fact sheets and memos. And so what we have is a new executive order. This new executive order is very different from the other one. It does several things very differently, but it continues to stereotypically and without sufficient factual defense target 6 now Muslim majority countries under the claim that we're keeping America safe. And so it's still problematic, but it's definitely a less problematic version than what was issued before. So I'll just explain to you quickly exactly how this executive order is different. First of all, it very clearly revokes the previous executive order. So a lot of the pending litigation, in fact, we were working this morning on an amicus brief in one of the federal litigations that were taking place. We're now canceling that and not doing that because the litigation is going to have to dramatically change. It's this executive order that the subject of the litigation referred to is no longer in existence. It will be implemented on March 16th. The previous executive order was implemented immediately, and it was very chaotic in its immediate implementation. This executive order will be implemented on March 16th, so there's actually time to prepare. It won't affect people who are in midair as the other one did. And effectively what it does is temporarily suspends the issuance of new visas for nationals from Sudan, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Somalia, and Libya for 90 days. Notably, Iraq is no longer on the list. In the executive order, they say that the reason for this is because Iraq is now cooperating and providing important vetting information to the U.S. government. It would be interesting to know what new information or what new processes have been implemented and whether, in fact, their being dropped from this list was a result of new information or as a result of the realization that Iraq is actually an ally of the United States. So what it doesn't do is revoke any visas. And the previous executive order revoked visas, which created mass chaos and difficulty for people. If you have a valid visa as of the day of the implementation of this order and January 27th, which was the date of the previous order, then you are absolutely fine. It also only applies to people who are outside of the United States. There are exceptions in this executive order when the previous one there weren't, and there are waivers. So again, does not apply to anybody who has a valid visa, and this includes, of course, green card holders. Additionally, the exceptions are if you have been admitted under the government's discretion. And it doesn't give any criteria, but it clearly says that notwithstanding this executive order banning people from these 6 countries for 90 days, if they decide to let you in, you can still come in. And they're behind the scenes things. They're going to determine that, I'm sure. Also, holders of valid non-visa travel documents. Humanitarian parole is one example of that. Or if you are a dual passport holder. So for example, if you have a Canadian passport and an Iranian passport, if you travel under your Canadian passport, then you're okay. Just do not travel under your Iranian passport. Diplomatic or World Bank, IMF similar visas are also exempt. That was true in the previous executive order. And then anyone who's been granted asylum or refugee status, withholding of removal, advanced parole, or protection under the Torture Convention, they are also exempt. So very helpfully, the executive order spells out certain exemptions. In addition, it provides for waiver possibilities. Now, waivers are something that consular officers or other immigration officers can issue at their discretion. And so it gives some criteria for those waivers. It gives examples for those waivers, including children who may be separated from their families, medical needs, and other kinds of things that will clearly help avoid, unlike the first time around on this executive order, the very embarrassing public relations disasters, like I think it was an infant or a 1-year-old who was at a hospital in Boston while his parents were in Iraq. These kinds of things have now been accounted for. This executive order asks the State Department for recommendations for additional countries to be banned or delayed or barred. Also, the executive order asks for a worldwide review to be conducted on the vetting process for all visas, and there's an accompanying memorandum that also explains that a little bit more. And it expressly says that they may decide whether they need additional information for some countries while not needing it for others. And so this is interesting because it's language that basically allows for discriminatory requirements between countries, but they're putting a placeholder in here that will allow them to make that determination. Okay, so that's the kind of visa and travel ban part of the executive order. Again, if you have a current visa, you're fine, but it does delay or postpone, maybe inevitably, that's unclear from this executive order, the issuance of visas following these exceptions and waiver provisions from now 6 countries. Iraq has been dropped. It also requires the implementation of uniform screening and vetting standards for all immigration, and it has certain requirements. They want the program to include things that get at interviews. Now, this is where kind of a values test, a belief test, and maybe a religion test isn't said out loud, but would easily be implemented. It says, for example, that there'll be application forms amended, interview processes amended, and other mechanisms to get at their beliefs, including their attitude of violence towards any group or class of people. Now, our alarm bells at the Tahirih Just Center went up around this because this could include violence towards women. There's another part of this same executive order that asks for research and data collection on foreign national populations currently living in the United States with regard to violence against women, and in particular so-called honor crimes. Why they want that data, we are unsure of, but this provision, which says that people may be prohibited from coming into the United States if they have violent attitudes towards any group of people, makes us wonder if there's an intention to include violence against women. The problem with that is that if you have a woman from another country whose husband may be subjecting her to domestic violence, let's say they're a family who has applied for refugee status. Domestic violence is not uncommon in a lot of countries, particularly those where refugees are from. If that's going to be a basis of denying refugee status, that would deny large swaths of people refugee status, and it was also prevent women from getting help when they're in the United States. It is not uncommon that women from refugee or other immigrant communities, while they were subjected to domestic violence and other violent practices in their home countries, largely because there were no laws to protect them in those home countries, when they come to the United States, it's an opportunity for them to stand up and say no. It's an opportunity for them to utilize local laws, dial 911 and say, we are now in a country where this is not okay. and I can now stand up for myself, and it changes the generational trajectory of children and families. And there are many, many stories of immigrants who've come to this country whose family dynamic and whose women have particularly benefited from the protections relating to violence against women in the United States. So we have a concern that this provision and other things mentioned in the executive order would somehow then preclude women who are subjected to domestic violence from getting protection in the United States. Okay, the refugee program. This was the other big feature of the previous executive order. And it does put on hold, like the other executive order did, refugee processing throughout the world. What it doesn't do is single out Syria. So the previous executive order basically said, we're banning refugees forever and always from Syria. They no longer do that. But they're simply saying that they're going to delay or put on hold the refugee processing program throughout the world that the United States maintains, and it's going to limit the annual number of those who can come as refugees to 50,000. The previous number was around 100,000, so this is a significant decrease in the number of refugees who will be allowed in the United States. That a delay or the ban is for 120 days from the effective date of the executive order, which is March 16th. During that 120 days, there will be a review of the application and adjudication process. And then after that, the travel of refugees can resume after 120 days, but only for stateless persons and nationals of countries where it has been determined that procedures are adequate to ensure security and welfare of the United States. So that's legal language that basically allows them to ban the refugee processing indefinitely, because in their subjective determination, if they believe that procedures are not adequate to ensure the safety of the United States, then they could continue to ban refugees process. Now, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. The United States has currently already one of the most stringent vetting processes for the processing of refugees in the world. Only 1 to 2% of all applicants for refugee status in the United States are approved. And refugees, when they come here, are then statistically very quickly integrated into the United States. Their children are educated, they start businesses, they contribute financially, and they are not statistically the source of terrorism. So just to put some of this language in perspective in terms of the concerns around safety. Another provision that's in this executive order that was not in the previous one is that it asks the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and the Justice Department to consider rescinding the exercise of authority under what's called the Material Support Bar. This is a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act that it's under 212D for any immigration lawyers who are watching, but it's called the Material Support Bar. And basically, this was a provision that says if you have materially supported terrorism, then you cannot get asylum in the United States. On its face, it looks logical, but the reality to it is that if you live, let's say, for example, you are a Yazidi girl living in Iraq, and, or no, now we have to pick a different country than Iraq. Okay, let's say Yemen, because now they're not subject to the ban. But this is true anywhere, actually, regardless of the ban, depending on whether you're applying for refugee status. So it could apply. Okay, Iraqi Yazidi girl. Now, in Iraq, we know that ISIS systematically targeted Yazidi girls for sexual slavery. They took them from their families, they executed the brothers and the fathers, and they sold these girls to ISIS members, and sometimes they transferred hands multiple times. Their abuse was horrific. But what became true was that this 212D provision, the material support ban, because it had no waivers, basically said that someone like her because she cooked for him, she cleaned his home, and had to sleep with him, even though it was forcible, was providing material support for a terrorism. And so when this law was first put in effect soon after September 11th, we realized that the victims of terrorism were being barred from seeking asylum in the United States when they were victims rather than the perpetrators of terrorism under this provision that says if you provide any material support at all to terrorists, you are to be barred. So as a result, there were a number of waivers, and there was an authority implemented that allowed for the discretion of conditions like duress, being under duress, like the Yazidi girls who were forcibly raped by ISIS. It would have allowed them to get asylum. Another good example has to do with medical professionals. If an ISIS soldier is taken to a hospital and those physicians do not ask the political opinion of their patient, particularly if they're unconscious, under this material support ban or bar, a physician would then be prohibited from seeking asylum in the United States because they had provided medical care to a terrorist. So as a result, there was an exercise of discretion and authority, a body of law that was developed to basically make this reasonable. This executive order asks for that to be rescinded. And so it doesn't, in fact, rescind it. It asks that it be rescinded. So this is something that's very concerning, that's new in this executive order, that will be the subject of advocacy by organizations like the Tahirih Justice Center and others. Okay, the other thing the executive order does is require the completion of the biometric entry and exit tracking system. This was also in the last executive order. This will essentially allow the United States to track who leaves the country. Right now, we don't track who leaves, we only track those who come in. It suspends the visa interview waiver program, which the executive order did previously as well. It now requires people to get interviews, even from certain countries where we had an agreement to waive that. And then it calls for the review of visa reciprocity arrangements. It calls for additional data collection, including information on the number and types of acts of gender-based violence against women, including so-called honor killings in the United States by foreign nationals. We're very interested to understand why they want that data. On its face, it would seem helpful to know, but because this is in an executive order designed to ban and bar people from the United States, as I mentioned earlier, we're worried that that will then give justification to forbidding entry of people who come from many cultures of the world where domestic violence may be common. It then has certain provisions around enforcement, and also says if your visa was marked revoked during the chaos of the previous executive order, you can get it back. That's very, very helpful to anybody whose visa was in fact revoked. And then there's other details that I won't go into. So that's the executive order. It is legally complicated as the other executive order was. It is less bad than the other executive order was. It continues, however, to bar refugees who have been persecuted, people who have suffered horribly, people who are not themselves terrorists but who are the victims of terrorists. And it has a few other interesting new provisions. It will continue to be the subject of litigation. It will continue to be the subject of concern, but the administration certainly has removed a lot of the most controversial provisions, particularly those that were being challenged on constitutional grounds. Thanks so much, and I'll try to keep you updated as new things happen.